Okay, today we are going to be talking dungeons and how are they feeling so far on the PTR. At the time of recording this, it is Thursday, the 19th, Wednesday, the 19th of February. So the patch is about a week away, and then the season is a week away after that. So we're about 2 weeks out from the season. PTR testing is probably going to finish up here very soon. We've seen multiple tuning passes to these dungeons. A lot of them are for better. Some are, I don't think there's any that are for worse, but there are some dungeons that are still like, they have some problematic things. Blizzard has also been making some changes that I am not a fan of, and I think that might hurt one dungeon in particular. As someone who's been playing Prot Warrior pretty rigorously on the PTR, they have heavily nerfed Theater of Pain tech for Spell Reflect, which makes me really sad. You can say the same thing about Diffuse Magic. Diffuse Magic is losing a lot of its value going into this season as well, just because Blizzard wants to homogenize what classes can do for some weird reason. Anyways, I'm going to be talking about this from kind of just my perspective as a tank, as someone who pushes high keys on live servers generally, and just kind of nerd out about each of the dungeons here. So let's just dive right into it. Now, I'm going to, I guess, quickly walk through these rankings and kind of explain them really quick. So S tier is like no notes, dungeons perfect. This is the most enjoyable dungeon I've ever done. And then it's obviously going to just dribble down. A is like there's a couple of things, but generally it's going to be pretty enjoyable. B tier is like it's mid. I'm not going to necessarily like have a great time every time in here, but it's like a fine dungeon. C tier is like there are some improvements to be made, but there's potential. And D tier is like this dungeon is just not enjoyable. I don't want to ever see this. I'm going to try to run it once or twice for IO and then just be done with it. Nothing really falls into D tier for me, but I'm going to probably put one dungeon in here just to kind of like paint a picture. Speaking of which, let's start with Priory of the Sacred Flame, or Priory of the Sacred Flame, as some of the kids say. Now, this dungeon, I have a few problems with it. First off, the dungeon has one of the most annoying mobs I've ever seen. If you're a tank player, one of the things you really enjoy about a dungeon or about the role is positioning mobs and bosses. And maybe you don't actively think about it, but you like to see mobs stacked up. Now, this dungeon has a ton of sharpshooter mobs in it. Sharpshooter mobs are casters that can't be kicked. They also, in this dungeon for some fucking reason, Blizzard thought it'd be a good idea to have them randomly disengage, throwing traps down that route and do a ton of damage, and just be annoying. I don't really enjoy this aspect of tanking. If you're not playing a Death Knight or a class with multiple knocks like Ring of Peace, or you're playing with like smart DPS or healers who are like actively trying to also keep mobs grouped with like Typhoon or their death grips or their knockbacks, this dungeon really quickly becomes super annoying. Now, don't get me wrong, there's ways to like path around some of these mobs, but there's other times where they're just there, they exist, and there's nothing you can do about them besides killing them. You also need a ton of count in this dungeon. You have to pull a ton of mobs in the first area to have enough count, because if you end up going up into the cathedral a little too early without getting enough count, you have to run all the way back at the end of the dungeon, which will kill your run, like without a doubt. Another thing that's really obnoxious about this dungeon is the fact that you have to like kill these mini bosses, and you have to kill 4 of them. So basically the way that the first boss works is it's like a build-a-boss. So there's 3 trusted guard members, and then there's 3 mini bosses, and each of the mini bosses in the dungeon are tied to those trusted guard. And so when you kill a mini boss, that trusted guard member will then come out to kind of explore to see what's going on. They heard a ruckus, and your group is there to kill them. So you kill a mini boss, and then you have to fight another mini boss, and these mini bosses are deadly enough where you don't really want to pull a ton of trash onto them, though it is feasible. They just have so much fucking health. And so you're spending probably the first 10 to 15 minutes of the dungeon just doing trash. And while the build-a-boss mechanic is kind of cool, there's probably going to be a set thing that you do, because some of the mini bosses are brutal and some of the mini bosses are like fairly easy to handle. Personally, I like going to the mid and the south end of the dungeon. I've had a lot of people on stream, whenever I do stream my testing of this, people are asking me why I do that. I just think that mini Emberlands is the easiest one to deal with. It's a little bit of tank damage, it's a little bit of group damage, but there's nothing else you really have to do, where the other mini bosses require kicks, there's a lot of movement, there's dodging, there's bleeds. and I think it becomes a little bit more of a headache for your healer. With set group damage, your healer just preps a heal and just heals through the damage. Like, it's not super difficult. The dungeon post first boss requires a fair bit of kicks. It requires a lot of movement from your tank, and the group damage that can occur is super high compared to other dungeons in trash pulls. So overall, it's just like, I don't want to rant about this too much, but I'm just not enjoying my time in Priory of the Sacred Flame. Now, the bosses are fairly cool. I think first, second, and third boss all have fairly interesting mechanics, but nothing that's like too cumbersome of your group. I think second boss has somewhat of a coordination issue with, or spell queue issue with some of their abilities from like the sacred pool that he puts on the floor that you have to soak. I forgot the name of the ability. There's also a lot of movement with hammers, but overall, I like the feeling of the fight. But the trash in this dungeon are very annoying, and the timer feels very tight with the amount of trash you have to chew through. All right, moving on. Next, we have Cinderbrew Meadery. I'm going to put this in C tier. Now, I think most DPS players, you guys are going to love this place. There's very low amount of kicks in the first area, and actually in like the third area of the dungeon. Well, depending on how you go through it. Tanks are going to fucking be miserable in here, and healers are going to be miserable in here. I also think there's somewhat annoying, from what I've seen, is there's actually some really kind of egregious mind control tech from priests in this dungeon. I hope Blizzard fixes that, since they removed all the spell reflect shit. But the dungeon just, it's big pulls, but it's very painful for tanks and healers, but DPS don't really have to do anything. Don't get me wrong, it's fun, and I think Blizzard can definitely like adjust some of the tuning or like the cooldown of some of these abilities, especially in like the early area of the dungeon. But once you clear the first room, you do have some choice, and I think that's always nice, being able to go left or right, depending on maybe like a lust timing or how you want to pull, or the cooldowns of your group. Going to the left towards like the brewing aspect of the dungeon, where you fight IPA, the second boss, in the dungeon journal. It's like very low target count, annoying casts, totems you have to kill. Just not necessarily the most enjoyable trash. It's kind of like a headache. There's also like really random group damage based on how you aim the frontal charge or the reckless charge from like the mob, the big strong men. I forgot what they're called. They're like the ogre looking dudes. They'll charge, and their damage occurs when they hit the wall, not when they like cast the ability. So healers might see this cast going off, and they're like, oh, I'm going to prep like a heal for it. But then your DPS sends it all the way down the hallway, and the damage doesn't happen for like 4 seconds or 5 seconds. Or a DPS sends it into the wall right next to your group, and it happens immediately. So this, accompanied with a lot of kicks and purges and enrages, make this area of the dungeon just a pain point for a lot of, like, for me. I'm not really talking for anyone else here. I've had groups had success in this run by holding W and just like zugging, and people know what to do. People who've been in here for the first time seem to struggle a little bit. So I don't know. It's just not a great dungeon. Also, the boss, like IPA boss design, is also very obnoxious. The boss spawns 3 adds. And what's nice about it as a tank player, you can control how they spawn. So the boss will start swirling around and spawning a bunch of pools on the ground. But during this channel, he'll also spawn adds. And the adds spawn on his based static position before he started that like channel. So you can like face the boss a certain way to force adds to spawn in a certain direction. But then you have to kite the boss around the room, and your DPS have to kill these adds. And ideally, you want to control them. So you want to keep them stacked, and you want to like blow them up really quickly. Because if they connect with the boss gains a massive absorb shield that will ultimately result in a wipe, because the boss now will just take so much longer to kill. In Pugs, I found this mechanic to be extremely obnoxious, because the adds respawn over time. So later in the fight, there's more and more adds you have to kill and control. Now, of course, coordinated groups will have no problem with this. Let's say you have a Death Knight, you'll grip the mobs together, and then you'll just like CC them for a bit, or you'll just blow them up. That's the other thing too, is like the mobs eventually enrage, and they have super crazy movement speed. So if you aren't playing like Roots, they just start sprinting at the boss. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of this dungeon. I've also yet, seriously, like this is the only dungeon that I've yet to kill a boss in. The last boss, Baron Bottom, fucking insanely overtuned. And I'm hoping they kind of fix her, because healers are just really struggling. This is a healer season for sure. And I have a concern with that, mostly because healers healers are like tanks. They don't really exist. And when they do exist, there's still a chance that they're not necessarily the best. And the HPS requirement, even in 12s right now, is ridiculously high. And despite us being tuned all the way up to 678, which by the way is max item level for the patch, healers are still struggling in this dungeon. Anyways, I don't want to rant too much about that. The rest of the dungeons are really good, so let's talk about them. Next, we're going to talk about Motherlode. Motherlode had some of like the better reworks coming into this patch. Now, we haven't seen this dungeon since BFA. If you played in BFA, you remember this dungeon horribly or very fondly, depending on at what level you push it and what classes you played with. There was some really cool tech in here with how you would handle trash. Groups had a ton of agency by like letting mech jockeys get into a mech or not get into a mech. There were certain trash mobs in here, especially the mech jockeys and or the mechanized peacekeepers, that did almost no damage way back in the day. Blizzard has gone back and they made peacekeepers like the worst mobs ever, and you don't want to deal with them at all if you can avoid it. They're manageable, which is nice, but you definitely want to minimize how many you pull because they create a bunch of void zones you can't stand in or you get pacified and take a ton of damage. The group damage they deal is insanely high, and they also hit your tank pretty hard. Most of the other trash though, like they've removed a lot of like weird trash in here. They removed a lot of like the little throw wrench guys, which has been nice for tanks. You can pull fairly large in here without being too punished. There aren't a ton of casters. A lot of the damage, you know, some damage is avoidable. Some damage is like static group damage, but it's never overwhelming for a healer. The boss designs, also 2 of them have like massive damage amps for DPS players, so that's always fun. I would say tanking the bosses is not like super enjoyable. This is probably one of the worst like tank dungeons, I would say, but it's not because you're not doing anything. Like in Cinderbrew Meadery, like there's a lot of like agency you have over like the boss's positioning, but in this dungeon it's like Azarok, you just stand there, and the coin operated crowd pummeler, you like move him away from coins, but you're not like stressing about it because he doesn't get stuck. Like they fix that part, which has made it nice, but at the same time now like there's no mechanic for the tank to really do. Overall, I think the trash in here has had major improvements though, and you can always pull big. I would say the only pain point in this dungeon that kind of kills it for me is the last like hill between Rixa Fluxflame and Mogul Razdunk, the third and final boss. Like, you're not pulling big, mines are annoying, priests will life grip you into mines for no fucking reason, and they changed the last boss right after I made a boss guide for it. They added a door to the final boss, so you can't really cheese the bombardments anymore, and they sped up the Gatling gun. So the Gatling gun is actually really fast now, and I don't know why they did this. It almost feels too fast. You have to be in melee, and it almost feels like you have to constantly be holding a movement key. So casters are gonna fucking hate this boss. So Mogul Razdunk, honestly, this dungeon was A tier for me until they changed the last 2 bosses, and now it's a B tier dungeon. I'm not gonna enjoy the end of the dungeon, but I do really enjoy the start of it. Overall though, just an average dungeon, I think. They reduced the timer by like significant amount of time as well. I think that's worth mentioning. It was like a 38 or 39 minute dungeon. They reduced it down to like a 33 or something like that. That doesn't hurt. Like the dungeon's good. They removed a lot of the trash, and with removing a lot of the trash and reducing like mob health and having damage amps on bosses, you're gonna fly through this place. All right, next let's talk Rookery. I've run this dungeon a handful of times. Depending on your group, this dungeon can be very painful or very easy. I would say that this dungeon is probably the most obnoxious because of its run back time. If you happen to wipe at any point in the dungeon, the run back is basically start of the dungeon or like first boss room, I guess. And so if you wipe in kind of the 2 big pain points of the dungeon, which is like near the final boss or before the second boss, the run back, despite them having like different openings for players to run through, like different hallways, it's still going to take you a while, which is very painful. There's also a handful of casters in this dungeon, especially like the first area, that can be extremely lethal if you pull too many together. Also, the idea in the first boss room is that you can pull the majority of the trash, but you definitely don't have to pull everything. But as I found out last night, when the boss is in the center of the room, his hitbox is so big that Avenger's Shield will end up pulling mobs in like the corner of the room, which is obviously just very funny. The last boss, I still think has a couple of complications with how big the boss room is and the movement speed that's required. Now, of course, I understand that the boss gives players movement speed to break the crystals, but even with that, in non-coordinated groups, it's very difficult to actually, like, coordinate who's going where. Especially on PTR, you're playing with people from all over the world, so obviously I'm playing with people who are in Europe, or they're playing in the kind of the CN region, and sometimes people don't speak English or don't speak your language, so it's sometimes hard to communicate, like, how to do some of those mechanics, so that's like a very niche PTR thing. But overall, I think the Rookery is a very fun dungeon. 3-boss dungeon, fairly large trash pulls. The big thing that's hurting it is the amount of kicks, and sometimes the amount of group damage that's required that your healer has to pump through. But if your healer's prepared for that, and your kicks are coordinated, or you have CDs for the packs that have a lot of casters in it, this dungeon is fast, especially because it only has 3 bosses, and it's just fun. All right, let's move into kind of my favorite dungeons. So these are going to be like the A tier dungeons that I've been really enjoying so far on the PTR. So let's talk Operation Floodgate. So Operation Floodgate, very good dungeon. So this is the very first dungeon we were able to test out on the PTR. It was available basically week 1. It was the only thing we could test, and it showcased Blizzard's new philosophy going forward. Fairly large pulls, low amount of kicks, moderate group damage in certain points for your healer to pump, but generally speaking, a lot of the stuff is avoidable, stoppable, or whatever you want to call it. There's a couple of annoying mobs in here that I think once people know how to handle, it's going to be easy. You have these like spinny boys. I honestly, I'm forgetting on their name, but you have these guys that cast Wind Up, which when you pull a lot of them together, it allows your group to do a ton of damage, but they fixate random players and they spin around. It's like a blade storm, and DPS get humbled by this mechanic. Every dungeon I'm in, no matter what level of player they are, everyone's dying to this. So coordinated groups will have a fine time because you'll have assigned CCs. They are mechanical, so mechanical mobs aren't affected by all CC. So for example, like paralysis or blind, so blinding light or blind from rogues. Mechanical creatures, they're not affected by the CC. So that part's a little obnoxious. The Shredinators can be a little annoying for people who don't understand them. But my only gripe with this dungeon is the healing requirement on Swamp Face as well as Giesel Gigazap. Outside of that, I enjoy almost every pull in here. I enjoy kind of the little bit of the objectives that you have to do. You have to basically destroy these 5 crates of weapons, as well as defeat the first 2 bosses before activating Swamp Face. But the pulls in here are good. The tank busters are at like kind of an all-time low, but you still have to pay attention to them. There's some min-maxy stuff you can do with like different pulls in here, whether it's like chaining everything to the first boss, or locking down certain casts, or Mind Soothe skipping. While it's not required, there's some cool tech in here. There's very good Spell Reflect tech still that Blizzard hasn't removed yet. When they do, I'm going to be very sad. But basically, most classes feel good in here. As long as you have a strong healer, everyone's going to have a lot of fun in this dungeon, I think. And I'm really looking forward to it. All right. Theater of Pain. I know this is I know this is going to be a hot take. This was an S tier dungeon for me until they removed Diffuse Magic and they removed Spell Reflect tech. Any Prot Warrior or even any insane like Fury or Arms Warrior mains out there, remember this dungeon fondly because you were able to taunt mobs, taunt bosses, and get really big Spell Reflect damage. While you can still Spell Reflect and basically immune some tank busters in here, it doesn't do damage anymore, so Prot Warriors are just down bad. And that in itself has dropped this dungeon for me from S tier to A tier. I think this dungeon's extremely enjoyable because there's a lot of really cool things you can do in here. A very common one is skipping the first trash pull, and while it's not required, you can do it. You can do it with Mind Soothe, Sap, Imprison, Paralysis with a Ring of Peace. You basically skip past the first trash pull, and you pull the Raging Bloodhorn into first boss, and you lust. And this is very rare. You don't often in a dungeon get to go into the first boss off the rip. There are some classes who get to pop their CDs before the dungeon even starts, and when you can do that and then get into first boss quick enough, you can obviously optimize CDs that way, going in with all of your buffs, your trinkets available, basically everything, the whole shebang, and being able to nuke down 4 target ad cleave for the duration of lust is very fun. It's efficient on healer CDs. The start of the dungeon is like chef's kiss, exactly like what I like to see in a dungeon. Going into the actual Theater of Pain underground to face off against the 3 wings of different bosses, you have Zav the Unfallen, Koltharok, and Gorechop. All wings feel distinctly different. Zav's wing has this kind of very nuanced single target aspect of it, which generally what I like to do is I like to do the first boss and then I go to Zav, because Lust will come up either at Zav in high keys or shortly after, like going into Gorechop's wing if you'd like. So you can really optimize Lust around different trash pulls, or you can optimize it around bosses. Having the option to choose though where you go is always going to be really cool to me. The routing in here also isn't as linear as a lot of people might make it out to be. There's like really cool Warlock Gate skip you can do with Zav's area. You can actually Warlock Gate skip past the second or like the 3rd mini boss, which is kind of nice. And while it is worth a fair bit of percent to skip this, you can make it up later by pulling different side trash areas in Koltharok's wing. You can make it up in Gorechop's wing, even though it's not necessarily all that great. Zav the Unfallen, I think, is a very cool take on an ad control fight. Oftentimes, you just have an ad that ramps up in difficulty, but in this fight, you have banners. Like, these banners just slow you, and then being slowed obviously becomes problematic when you have to dodge frontals. So I think it's just kind of interesting. I think all the boss fights in here are probably some of my favorite boss fights in the dungeon, or in the dungeon pool period. The only issue that I have in this place still is just the travel time when you're taking the orbs from platform to platform. There's just like, it's just not super great. Overall though, oh, and I guess like my only other complaint is it is still a 5 boss dungeon. 5 boss dungeons I think are just kind of archaic in a way. I don't think they can obviously remove a boss from here. I think a front of challengers could be a mini boss instead, and maybe deal maybe more damage but have like significantly less health and just make it a mini boss and then like not I don't know. Like, it doesn't really change anything because you have to kill them anyways to go downstairs. So having it a boss fight is fine. As long as boss fights never take like 3, 4, 5 minutes, I'm okay. I'm okay with this dungeon. I have, at a 12 level at least, have 2 chests of this place, so I'm not like super worried about it. I'm nervous that they might try to tune some things up. Oh, and then the mini bosses. The mini bosses are a little egregious. Again, if you get a bad mini boss or 3 bad mini bosses in Zav's area, it can be a little bit more hectic for your healer, but a lot of the mechanics can be LOS'd. So you could just simply like hug a pillar, line of sight whenever something targets you, and then you don't take damage. If Blizzard changes that, I'm going to be very sad. Okay, let's talk Darkflame Cleft. So, Darkflame Cleft is unironically one of my favorite dungeons going into next season. What's really selling it for me is the aesthetic. I know this is kind of weird because I'm not someone who's super into like the role play aspect of this game, but I think the lore behind Darkflame Cleft is pretty tight. I've always liked that I like that they're exploring kobold culture a lot more. They're always just like, they've always been a funny race with like, take candle. And then now you understand why they revere the light so much through like the light, because they're scared of the darkness. And then the darkness is a manifestation in this dungeon that you actually get to deal with later on. And I think that's just fucking dope. But anyways, the worst part about this dungeon for me, before I talk about the things that I do like, the least favorite part about this dungeon for me is the starting trash. There are a lot of caster mobs, and there's a couple of mobs that just throw rocks. So these are sharpshooter mobs is what I like to refer to them as. And they're mobs that can't be kicked, but they cast. So things like the harvesters from Necrotic Wake are something I would refer to as a sharpshooter mob, despite them having drained fluid. Despite kicking them, they're never going to move. So there's a lot of those at the start of the dungeon. And generally, you would just be like, well, you can skip most of that stuff if you are able to. Well, unfortunately, the percent is very tight in this dungeon. You essentially have to hold W, clear almost all of the trash, and at the end of the dungeon, you'll have like it's like a Grim Batol type dungeon. You have to pull almost everything to get count. And it's like a pick your poison. You either have to pull this trash, which is very lethal for your group, or at the very end of the dungeon, there are mobs that are very lethal for your tank. And your tank may or may not be constantly releasing and running back, and your group has to kite. But outside of that, outside of the very painful trash at the beginning and the end of the dungeon, the boss design in here is so good. I think all of these fights as a whole are very good. I think tanking specifically is a little boring. I think the first, second, third, and fourth boss for a tank, not super enjoyable, but the aesthetic is very nice in here. The first boss has a lot of like random ad control, or like just pad damage you could basically do. There's a little bit of healer damage to the Reckless Charge. You obviously need enough damage to burst down the minecart, but outside of that, very fun like hectic Adclee fight that you don't get to experience all that often in a Mythic Plus setting. Blazicon, I think, has a very cool like kind of cadence to it, where you have to control which candles are lit and which ones aren't lit. Now, obviously, there's not a lot of thinking here. You basically start the fight by trying to light as many candles as possible to minimize the group damage you're going to take, and then you're spending the rest of the fight dodging frontals and trying to extinguish candles to make sure the boss and your group has room and the boss isn't doing an insane amount of damage. So I think that aspect is really, really cool. For a tank, you're doing nothing, so it's very boring. You're standing there, and if you leave melee range for even a second, your group is just gonna fucking wipe, which is very annoying. The hitbox on this boss used to be a lot bigger, and now it's basically you have to stand within the hitbox, but there's nothing really going on here. The biggest thing I see people complain about is the minecart event. And I think these people, if this is you, I'm sorry, but you clearly didn't test PTR. The new dungeon, or the updated minecart event, is so fucking fine. Like, it's so free. There's candles littered everywhere. The radius on the circle is massive. When you're not in combat, the cart moves very fast, and when you're in combat, it moves very slow. And that's so your casters can do damage. Let your casters cast and do damage to defeat the mobs, because honestly, these mobs slap the tank, and they need to die very quickly. So the cart moving at a snail's pace is absolutely fine. It's not hurting your timer. It's set on a single path. You know what's worse than this? Spires of Ascension RP. Theater of Pain flying through the air RP. There's so many things in dungeons that are worse than this Darkflame like cart mini game, and people won't stop bitching about it, and it's so triggering to me because it's not that bad. It's a mechanic in a dungeon that I find actually kind of enjoyable. Tanks, you can optimize this. You can do big pulls for your DPS, and then you can make the minecart go as fast as you want because there's no more trash. Tanks, pick up a candle, run ahead, pull 3 packs, pull them back to the minecart, deposit your candle, your DPS blast, you pop an immunity or some big CDs, and then the cart goes through the entire event. There's ways to optimize this in set groups, and pugs, it's fine. Just like it's part of the dungeon. I'm not against this mechanic. I got a little heated there. I apologize. You're allowed to have your opinion about this minigame, but I think people are really harping on it for no reason, because Blizzard has clearly made it a goal to make it as little as least painful as possible, and I think they've done a pretty good job at that. But honestly, fuck throwing dynamite at the big man. I don't care for this part of the dungeon. It feels like a waste of time. Anyways, let's talk about my favorite dungeon, Mechagon Workshop. This isn't necessarily an S tier dungeon. I think I'm going to put it up here just so it looks... I'm going to do... kinda. Because I think it's the best SA tier dungeon, but I honestly just want it. I want a dungeon in every single category. Now, why do I like this dungeon so much? So they made some changes to this dungeon, mostly the trash throughout. They've actually reworked most of the things in this dungeon. And what really sells it for me, despite it being linear and despite there being some annoying little mini games, is they've really reduced the nuanced bullshit that you had to do in order to be efficient in this dungeon. They've removed the Warlock Gate skip, kind of. They've removed the mind control tech, kind of. Two very annoying things in this dungeon that I think most players could agree that were a little bit painful. We already saw this in Season 1 of The War Within. Necrotic Wake. If you didn't have a priest in your group, it was near impossible. Not saying it was impossible, but it was near impossible to do this key any higher than a 16 or 17. But if you had a priest in your group, you instantly just added 2 levels to this key, because you would just mind control crafters, and the crafters do the damage for you throughout the entire run. It's like having an extra DPS with you. That was kind of similar in this dungeon, being able to mind control the Tinkerers with the squirrels. Again, fun mechanic, fun gimmicky mechanic, but unfortunately, in today's world, people will abuse that. People will, and that's the way you would have to time this key. At the highest level, of course, it wouldn't matter in 99% of cases. They've removed that. That's already an A+ for me. Them adding more trash at the start of the dungeon, at first when they did this, I was like, oh man, this is gonna fucking suck. Because back in the day, what you would do is you would send your tank down on a solo mission. Your tank would basically pixel stack all the mobs, and then the mobs would kill themselves, and then you wouldn't have to spend any of your CDs, and you'd be able to go into the boss with Lust and all your stuff. They've now made it where there's a lot more trash at the start, so you can actually send your CDs in like the first pull or two and have it for the boss. And just, it's like more enjoyable just to be able to hit more things as a DPS, as a tank, kind of getting everything prepped up for the first boss. The mobs aren't too difficult. I would say the only thing annoying about this first boss room is the saw blades that spin around, but if you know where they spawn and you know what to look out for, it's not that difficult to dodge. But yeah, you just get to turbo blast the first little bit of the dungeon with big 6 to 12 target pulls. Now the first boss is now a 2-target cleave encounter. There's no damage reduction that starts the fight. The Platinum Pommeler will eventually get a damage reduction through his platinum plating, but the tanks will remove that pretty quickly. And not only does he get not only does it remove the damage reduction, but it makes him take more damage for a little bit of time. So you can really optimize DPS. You obviously need to cleave them down fairly evenly. There's a little bit of responsibility on the tank for like good positioning, but as a tank player, I really like this fight because there's a lot of responsibility on the tank to make sure you're getting the boss's plating removed, make sure you're baiting the maximum thrust. If you're really optimizing it, you can actually stun the ground pound to help your healer out. There's a lot of cool things a tank can do in this dungeon that I'm really enjoying so far, and I'm having a blast. Moving down into kind of the scrap area leading up to Cujo, them adding a lot of trash in here or fixing or changing a lot of the trash has made this dungeon so much more enjoyable. While you do have to pull the drills kind of by themselves, the corrosive gunk mobs are way better. You can still line of sight their healing absorb if you really want to, and there's ways to actually sync them all up by stunning them and keeping them CC'd. If you don't want to line of sight, you can also just do that instead. So the pulls in this area are also pretty large. The drills do a lot of tank damage now, which I think is a little bit more enjoyable. They did tank damage back in the day, but now, like tanks, you kind of have to pay attention. Those types of mobs I think are relatively enjoyable. Cujo got slightly reworked, but not really. He just got like visual updates, which I think has been pretty enjoyable. And he's got some, like, he no longer will leap on more than 3 players ever. So the fight's a little bit more consistent, but there's really cool line of sight tech you can do with this boss. I don't think Blizzard will remove it just because I can't imagine them being able to recode how the boxes operate with line of sight tech, because they have like a base model size and the animation to show them enlarged from the heat, they'd have to I don't know what it actually would have to push players around if they did that. So I'm not really sure if they'll ever fix the line of sight tech, but I think that's very cool for the high-end tanks who like to really optimize their DPS. But they also made it so it's not as punishing if you aren't able to do that consistently, because the venting flame cast only lasts for 3 seconds instead of like 6 or whatever it was before, or 4 seconds instead of 6. So you're spending less time behind the box and more time damaging the boss. The visual updates on the mobs in the like 3rd section of this dungeon, so good. The first time I saw this, like my mouth dropped. I just was like, this is so sick. This is so cool. It's very easy to dodge now. Obviously, like, it's fast, so you have to respect it. But like the sonic pulse, the big electrical AoE cone thing, I don't know what it's called. Very fun. The visual update on this is great. I like the mini game of having to run through the I don't know, maybe I'm a masochist or something, but I really like the mini game of having to run through. Obviously, it's really annoying for pugs and when you're watching people fail over and over and over again and you're watching your Mythic Plus timer go down, but once you understand the pattern of how the mobs move, it's very easy to make it through. Rest in peace back in the day in Shadowlands when you could just Door of Shadows through the maze, but nonetheless, the 3rd boss had some visual improvements as well to make it a little less egregious. The swirl animations are great in here, and they spaced out the last couple trash pulls leading up to King Mechagon himself that have just made it more enjoyable. I don't know, maybe I'm just like a simp for this dungeon, but I've always loved Mechagon. They've removed the things that I didn't like. They added some things that at first I was kind of like adverse to, and then now I'm like, wait, this is actually kind of sick. So I think Mechagon's going to be a fairly fun dungeon. There's some cool like little nuanced Brewmaster tech you can do in here, or Monk tech more generally. I think this dungeon is so good, and I'm really hoping people end up enjoying it more than they did in previous seasons, if they maybe didn't enjoy it back in Shadowlands or even back in BFA when we saw it for the first time. So that's my dungeon tier list. That's how I think the dungeons are doing so far. Now, if you made it this far in the video, obviously thank you so much for watching. I know this is going to be a long one, but I'm really excited for season 2. I have routes that are going to be coming out in the next couple the next couple of weeks before the season starts. I have boss guides that are already up on Patreon, so if you're interested in seeing those early, you can go check that out. If not, they will be available on YouTube in the near future. And I'm also going to have kind of dungeon walkthroughs as well. So if you are interested in any of that type of content and you aren't subscribed to the channel, feel free to. It's free and you can always change your mind later. And of course, a massive shout out to my current Patreon supporters, because without you guys, I couldn't make content like this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.